Hello, I'm John Feldt. This is the Blue Water Outlook briefing for the Apalachicola-Chattahoochee-Flint Governing Board on June 28, 2013. Well, I'd like to start off today's briefing by taking a look back at what's occurred over the last 5 months or so during the water recharge season. And these are the departures from normal rainfall for the months of January through May. And blue and purple indicates surplus rainfall. You can see here from the chart image here on the right that blues are 3 inches or more normal for the month, purple's up to 8 inches more, and then yellows and reds are below normal, or deficits of precipitation. So we started off on a positive trait in parts of the basin in January, mainly to our west. The southern reaches of the basin started off in drought, severe drought. We're very dry. But the big month was definitely February. Look at this here. Look how much rain above normal. We had 8 inches more surplus rain over a very large part of the ACF basin, and that was really the game changer for the winter months. March was a lot more quiet, hit or miss. And then April and May, the focus shifted up to the northern part of the basin, where the northern part received much more recharge, but it sort of shut off on the south. I'm going to talk about that a little bit, in that we have some recent changes in the far southern part of the ACF. But the story for the winter recharge season was really very beneficial recharge in February over a large part of the basin, and then more recently, April and May into June over the northern part of the basin. Now, how wet has it been? Well, if we look at the February through April statewide ranks, you can see out of 119 years for Georgia, it was 112th wettest. So very wet in the period of February through April, and that's why we had such drastic changes in water resources over a very short period of time. Matter of fact, if you look at the bottom image here, these are classification changes to the drought monitor. Over 6 months, that light blue was a 5-class improvement. So that region went from extreme drought to well above normal precipitation and totally erased the drought impacts in that region. But more recently, look at the top image here. This is the last 4 weeks. What you can see here is it's beginning to creep in the other way. We're beginning to go back towards deterioration of 1 or 2 classifications. Actually, that's 1 classification there, that light brown. So we're starting to go the other way over the southern part of the basin, but we had, I think the unusual was that incredible 5 category improvement over this last 6 months. Another way to look at this is the accumulated precipitation for Atlanta. Let's start off with the top image here in green. This starts in March and goes through the current date. And you can see for Atlanta, the northern part of the ACF basin, it has been steadily increasing the surpluses. That's that green area. The further away it gets above that line, we're getting increasing surpluses of precipitation. If we go to the bottom graph, this puts it in a little bit more perspective going back a year. You can see that we're just sort of now getting to the point where we crossed the line in May or June to normal, and now we're getting surpluses. So from a long-term perspective over the year, we've just made up all that rain we lost last year. We just got to that point. So it's good for the northern part of the basin, and this accumulated precipitation, I'd show it in another area, but I don't have an area that a site that actually has this type of data over the southern part of the ACF. Now here's a really tricky image here, and I'm going to try to describe this. It's going to be a little bit more difficult. This is a time series plot going back from the 1980s to the current time. The current time is on the right, right here. And going up here is the duration of drought. So a couple things here. The most simple would be the areas of yellow are times of drought. Areas of green are times of excess rain. This is based on the Standardized Precipitation Index, or SPI, for Georgia. So you see the variability in periods of drought, and these periods here most likely due to La Nina events that I've talked about in the past. Remember we had that double dip La Nina, almost a triple dip, and what we see here is the more widespread the drought as far as a time period. So if the drought extends over a longer period of time, it's going to be extending further up here. So these droughts here that go all the way from starting here and then all the way up here towards the top of the graph are more prolonged droughts. And then the shading is the intensity. So this was a prolonged and intense drought, fairly long and prolonged and intense drought. Here's more recently. Look at the green here. So this is saying from a recent perspective, we've seen this improvement, but then from a longer term perspective, we still see that we still have these accumulated precipitation deficits. This is another way of what I showed you in the last couple slides. But what I want to point out is the variability of drought and how significant it was and how we're beginning to work out of it in the short term, but still from a longer term perspective, we haven't quite worked out of it. The U.S. Drought Monitor also shows that, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this other than right here. Look at how quickly that cliff, we went from drought, large percentage of the state of Georgia in droughts at roughly 70%, down to 0. So it just really changed rapidly. And I think that's one of the more unusual things with this drought. Look at these past ones here. You can sort of see a little bit more gradual getting out of it. But this one just dropped right off. So I think if anything that was unusual about this one was how quickly we worked out of it. Okay, so let's get into the state of the ACF. I like to look back, and then I like to look at right where we're at right now to understand what's going on before I make a forecast. So the 7-day average stream flow over the basin ranges from well above normal over northern reaches of the basin to near normal over the southern bases. Now there's some exceptions here. Over the southern part of the basin, some of the smaller tributaries have really began to fall over the last couple months due to below normal rainfall. So I think if we look at it in more detail, we see that it ranges from well above normal stream flow over the northern reaches, normal over the central reaches, and then as we get down into the southern reaches, we begin to get from normal along the main stem river to below normal to the tributaries. Well, I like to show 3 duration hydrographs, one from the upper reaches, one from the middle, and one from the lower reaches of the basin, and that tells 3 different stories. These are all tributaries, so they're going to change a little bit quicker than the main stem river. So here's on the upper river basin of the ACF, and you can see the river prior to the recharge season came in here. It's running very low in the brown, which is well below normal. Then as we got through the recharge of December, January, and February, came up to normal and into the blue. And it's still running very well above normal up in the blue range here, and this is the upper river reaches of the ACF. If we get in the middle, we also see a more extreme below normal, setting record lows. But as we got through the winter months, it went back into normal, and it's still remaining generally in the normal. You sort of see some dips here. Without rain, it dips into below normal, then it gets into above. But for the average here, pretty much in the normal range as far as the stream flow. And finally, if we get into the lower part of the ACF River Basin, you can see this was hit. It was in the core of drought, setting record lows. It did come up during the recharge season, but here, this is the point I wanted to make. Many of the tributaries are dropping down very low over the southern reaches of the ACF River Basin. Okay, so if we look at the short-term and long-term indicators, that also tells the story of a short-term improvements versus long-term. From a short-term perspective, what we see here is green over most of the area. So that's saying from a short-term perspective, the northern part of the reaches have seen actually surplus amounts of precipitation. And then as we get down to the middle part, we start getting into neutral, and that's the white. And then we get down in the far southern reaches. In the short term, we're actually beginning to see some negative type indicators. So we're beginning to see that more concern over the southern part compared to that northern part. Now, if we look at the long-term indicators, these are more like groundwater, long-term averages. We see still it's beginning to show up in the northern part, central. Even from a long-term perspective now, we're beginning to see above normal conditions, but then neutral conditions over the southern reaches. Now, Lake Lanier, I'm not going to look at all the reservoirs, but Lake Lanier obviously plays a very major role. And I can't remember how many years I've been talking about how low it was, including the record low years. But look at this. We're almost near a record high It's above the top of the conservation pool line, zone 1, and you can see that the forecast is to gradually come down, but we have a lot of leeway to go with water as far as Lake Lanier goes, running actually above normal for the time of year. Historical normal is that orange line. You can see it's significantly above that, so there's a lot of way to go to reduce that, and I'm not going to read the minds of the Corps, but I would think with getting into tropical season, they're going to probably be working to get that down towards the historical average for the time of year. Speaking of tropical activity, if you get my information, once a month this time of year I put out sort of a summary of what's going on. We've actually had a little bit of rain from a tropical system, Andrea, very early towards the very start of the season. Not a whole lot of rain in the central and southern parts of the ACF, but there was rain in the northern part. And these are some of the tropical forecasts: AccuWeather, NOAA, University of Colorado. And what you can see is all are forecasting above normal activity. And the three reasons for that are continuation of this multi-decadal cycle of higher activity, warmer than normal tropical Atlantic and Caribbean sea surface temperatures, and then that we're in an El Nino neutral, so it's not going to influence it one way or the other. It's not going to suppress hurricane formation. Speaking of El Nino, we're in neutral. Green is the neutral forecast. And you can see what we'd want to look at here is we want to look at, for the Southeast U.S., either a strong El Nino, which would be pushing us towards enhanced rain, or a strong La Nina, which would be pushing us towards decrease in rain. And even though both of those are increasing as we get into next year or late this year, what you can see is neutral is by far the highest category. So for right now, I think we just need to look at this neutral pattern continuing until models start to give us some sign that it could be changing. Okay, as we'll get into forecast here. One of the forecasts I like to look at is this IRI multi-model probability forecast. Now for a number of months, it's really been showing this enhanced precipitation over the Southeast U.S., and that's been working out very well so far. That's on the left with the area of green. If we look at it on the right, that's temperature, and that's no shading, so that's saying normal temperatures. And that's worked out pretty good. Normal temperatures and above normal precipitation with the highest probabilities over, looks like the 40%, 45% into the northern parts of the river basin. Now, one of the things when I look at these models, they're initialized off existing conditions. So there's definitely a bias, I guess you could say, towards persistence in some way, which I wouldn't argue over that. But that doesn't mean things can change. One of the things that I look at very closely are feedback loops. And I don't think we're quite in a positive feedback loop over the northern part of the basin quite yet. But as we get it into the next weeks to the next month, if we continue this daily or maybe every 2 or 3 day cycle of thunderstorms, we'll have enough upper soil moisture to continue to feed daily convection. Then we get into that positive feedback. That's very important as we get into summertime, that we don't get into a negative feedback. And right now I don't see much sign of a negative feedback. I know there's below normal precipitation over the southern third of the basin. It's getting quite dry, but I don't think it's to the extent where I'd say that's a negative feedback. I think you need a more widespread area and more persistent area of either above or below normal precipitation. If anything, I think the tendency is towards a minor or weak positive feedback at this time. So the forecast from NOAA, summertime, as I've mentioned in the past, it's not nearly as easy to forecast as wintertime, but pretty much for temperature forecast on the top, this shows above or equal chances for above or below normal temperatures, and generally speaking, above normal precipitation over the north. This is pretty much a persistence type forecast from what we have, and I couldn't argue with it one way or another based on what I'm seeing and what the models are showing. The drought outlook is not calling for a return to drought, although I am a little bit would lean towards possible development over the far southern reaches of the basin. I wouldn't be surprised if that pops in an area of yellow over the next couple months. So my last time I spoke to you right before the winter recharge season, it's the bottom right here. You can see that I sort of put some of the key factors, whether the drought would improve, remain the same, or worsen. And what you can see here is most of the things I looked at, I was calling for the possible improvement. Well, it did improve much quicker than I thought, but I think I was in the right direction there. So I look at these things again. I like to go through these factors that I put here. ENSO would sort of lean not one way or the other, wetter or drier, sort of neutral. Climatology, for most of the river basin, we've been above normal. So I think climatology was probably going to pull us a little bit towards the drying outside a bit, not a lot. I almost had that in the middle, but I pushed it a little bit towards dry. On the upper part, due to Lake Lanier, I think reservoir considerations, there's ample water to be let downstream. Persistence, why fight the trend? I mentioned that, so that's leaning towards more of above normal. Climate models are indicating a little bit more above normal. I mentioned feedback and tropical. So right now we definitely have much of the factors leaning towards normal or above normal precipitation through the summer months and into the early fall, with really not a whole lot pointing towards dry conditions. Okay, I think that's pretty much my briefing. I'd be glad to take questions right now. Also, I'd like to, hopefully you're seeing the Blue Water Outlook ACF report that I put out each month. It's a summary of conditions. If you haven't seen it, you can subscribe. I have the link here. And pass this along. We don't charge this. This is sponsored by the Georgia Water Center at Albany State University. And we definitely would like to pass this along to just not the governing board, but anyone who's interested in this. You might want to also consider subscribing to Blue Water Outlook. I put a lot more science type information in a full subscription to Blue Water Outlook, so you might want to consider that, and you can get that at Blue Water Outlook as well. So that concludes today's briefing, and I will be updating information from time to time, and you can get the latest information either by emailing me at john@bluewateroutlook.com or signing up at bluewateroutlook.com for a subscription. Thank you for listening to today's briefing.